Thank you, President Osmick, and good morning, colleagues. I am happy that we are here today for many reasons, but also want to be honest, as I have pledged to be, that this is a bittersweet morning for me as we take this important step to fulfill our commitment for frontline workers, something that I started working on with Representative Cedric Frazier at the beginning of 2021 when I was a brand new member of this body. The bill that was originally introduced at the start of 2021 was meant to replace lost wages and restore lost time for the essential workers who were going into work every day to keep us alive and healthy, and who had, because of COVID, gotten sick themselves or their family members got sick and they had to use their own leave time, or they lost pay because they had no leave time in order to quarantine, take care of themselves or their family members. That was the original intent of the legislation that was introduced. And the employers, those who were not covered by the federal language that was adopted to protect employers and employees at the start of COVID, just were unwilling to come to the table at all on this piece of legislation, nor was the Senate majority willing at all to deal with that piece of legislation, even though there was funding available in the form of federal tax credits. We just could not get that issue started in this body, past the House, but we couldn't get it started. And so because of a very, very persistent group of Minnesotans who had worked on the front lines and their persistence in showing up to the Capitol and arguing, showing up and telling their stories, showing up and persisting, at the end of last session, you'll recall that there was an agreement, both chambers, Democrats and Republicans, that frontline workers would receive hero pay, hazard pay, bonus checks, frontline worker checks. We set aside $250 million for that and set up a working group that were charged with the work of figuring out who and how that money would be distributed. We did work all summer. We were back able to meet in person again, which was nice. There were members of this body and in the House and from the administration, 9 of us that did that work together. And in September, that came apart as well because there were 3 members of the working group who did not agree, and 3 of the 9 members who did not agree was able to scuttle the entire body of work. That was with the 3, unfortunately, the 3 Republicans who served on that working group. And so while there was a deadline for us to complete our work and to answer the question for frontline workers, instead we did nothing, and the frontline workers continued to wait on our commitment, a commitment that we made right here in this body in June of 2021. They continued to raise their voices, they continued to mobilize and organize, having faith that in the end, the commitment that we made in both bodies and with the administration would hold. And here we are now in April of 2022, finally taking action, despite the obstruction and the empty promises that for a long time were the voice of our GOP majority. I want to say how proud I am of my DFL colleagues in this DFL caucus for their unwavering support for frontline workers. I know some thought this was the only issue that I was working on and probably grew tired of my talking about it, but I am grateful for that unwavering support and know that we are here today because of that unwavering support, that undying commitment, that when we give our word in this body, that we will uphold that and fulfill that commitment, and that this body said the work of frontline workers mattered, that they took risks, that they were required to go to work. That kept us healthy and safe and our economy moving. And one of the reasons we have the surplus we have today is because of that important work, I'm grateful to my DFL colleagues for their continued support of that. This legislation that we're debating this morning, this agreement, is long, long overdue, and I will say that we have paid a significant price to get here when we think about the things that have come before it. You'll recall the issues that we have already completed this session, $700 million in reinsurance to health insurance companies was a priority before frontline workers. An $8 billion budget-busting tax bill that favors the wealthy over workers was a priority ahead of frontline workers. And attached to this proposal, of course, is the $2.7 billion, some of which is a tax cut for our corporations, many who profited significantly during the pandemic. Those were all priorities for the Republican majority ahead of the commitment that we made to frontline workers. And in fact, I think that it is only because of the unending persistence of those workers who were not going to stop saying, you made a commitment to us, that this provision of $500 million for frontline workers is actually included in this today. And I want to thank those workers. You shouldn't have had to work so hard to make this happen. We called you heroes. You shouldn't have had to work so hard to make this happen, but I recognize and see what you have done, and I am grateful for it. I also often wondered at the start of this session when we passed the $2.7 billion in unemployment insurance, if maybe we needed to give a guided Capitol tour to the majority leader so he could understand where the compromise actually existed. That didn't happen, but here we are now today, so there is a reason. There are a couple of things that have already been mentioned, so I will not go deeply into them, but Article 3, the provision, the LCRC, and what was agreed to in that really does silence the minority if the majority chooses to do that. It doesn't belong in this bill. It is, I think, a dangerous precedent. It is something that concerns me greatly about the legislature and this institution, because we have seen ourselves move away from cooperation, we've seen ourselves move away from collaboration, and we have seen more and more often the will of the majority suppressing the will of the minority, and that's not right in a democratic institution. And while this is a small provision, it represents the silencing of the minority, and that's trouble. That seasonal school employees were left out of this agreement is a real disservice to unlicensed school workers, and I think we will pay a price for it if we don't finish it this session. School bus drivers, people who work in our cafeterias, there are unlicensed school employees, and when they're done with their work this year in their schools, they probably will find a job that pays them better. So if we don't figure out how to include them in unemployment insurance, we will likely have shortages, like we're having workplace shortages all over. And if our kids can't go to school next fall because they can't catch the bus, we can look at ourselves and say we should have done better. We should finish this work. We should finish this provision before this session is done, and I just want the body to know that I am committed to that, and I hope you'll join me in that fight. This morning, registered nurses got up, they put on their uniforms, and they went to work to take care of patients in hospitals. This morning, teachers took their lunches to the classroom, and along with ESPs, are teaching our kids. This morning, people who work in nursing homes reported in assisted living facilities and group homes to do their work. This morning, people who take care of our children are doing that important work. Meat cutters are back to work. The people in our courts are back to work. Those are the people who kept us alive and well. And when we think about the work that they do, we know now that those critical infrastructure positions are weak. We know that they have paid a price. We know that they're leaving those jobs because of what they've experienced for the last 2 years. And so before I close, I think it is important for us to recognize that this cannot be our last work for workers, that we need to increase worker wages. We need to improve workplace safety in order to make sure that we retain the workforce important to us and important to Minnesotans going forward. President Osmek and members, I appreciate your indulgence as I recap where we have been. Like most things, this is a compromise. It isn't balanced. The workers who did so much for us have had to wait far too long. Far too long. And this contains provisions that don't belong in the bill. I'm really grateful for the frontline workers and all they've done. The $750 that they are going to get from this deal is important to them. Thank you, Mr. President.